My camera woman is absolute and the fact is I was trying to make the announcement, but unfortunately she missed the moment. But in case you want to catch up with what we're doing today, effectively we're doing another sound check because, again, our setup is a bit
I don't think you'll be speaking like this, to be honest, so it's not a very good
It is a
check.
definite presenting style which you see all across news channels everywhere.
If you ask me, the talent is a little bit
The crew can be fired.
Eyes.
It is worth noting. Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. That sounded a bit weird, didn't it? Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Just in case you're wondering, the setup's changed yet again. It's because I'm still trying to nail down the setup and find out what works best for filming. And I'm talking like the news presenter still. I don't know why, but it's really catching. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about how to paint up one of my favourite Dark Angel characters. Arguably the guy that takes his job a little bit too seriously, and that is Asmodai, the Master of Repentance. So let's begin by removing the model from the sprue and gluing the relevant pieces together. Now it's worth noting I'm not going to glue everything together because I want to do this as a sub-assembly, purely and simply because if it's all fully assembled it's going to make it quite difficult to reach certain areas of the model. Now looking at the model, on the face of it, it seems quite busy, but actually if you look at it in terms of its various elements, the two main parts of the model are actually his robe and his capelet, and yes, apparently that is what it's called. So I'm going to start with the capelet. So I begin by applying a base coat of a dark purple, in this case King Purple by AK Interactive. And the reason for this is that it provides a really good base for those recesses of the green. So now I'm going to start applying green to the model. You want a really dark green for this. I've gone for black green by AK Interactive, but I've also mixed it with black at a 2:1 ratio. Now going on from this, I'm going to build up the green by going up in vibrancy pretty much every time. Every time I go up in value, I'm being more and more selective of where I'm placing these highlights. And so the reason for this is that I want to start creating that sense of depth within the fabric. And I'm also applying the paint in sort of scratchy motions so that it has that sort of sense of texture to it, because I don't want the capelet to be really sort of smooth and flowing like a sort of satin fabric. I don't particularly want that. So now once you're happy with those values that you've applied, it's time to unify them a bit more, and I find the easiest way to do this is to get a diluted mix of Dark Angel's contrast green, and then you just apply it all over those green sections, and it does tie all those different values together really well. So now with the capelet done, it's time to move on to the main body of the model, which is, again, the robe. This is going to be a cream colour, which is pretty much like the box art. Now I'm going to begin by using a very dark brown, and in this case it's AK Interactive Grim Brown. So with that brown now applied, it's time to start lightening the colour. I do this by incorporating more desaturated browns and start working into cream and sort of ivory colours. And as you can probably see, there's lots of sort of creases and folds in the fabric. And when you start to incorporate these lighter mid-tones and highlights, you want to start glazing those colours in to get a smoother transition. So if you haven't done glazing before, you're effectively using heavily diluted paint and working in passes effectively. So each time you make a pass over an area, you're increasing the intensity of the paint that you're putting on. Now when you're doing this, you want to make sure that the pass you've just done is completely dry before you do another one. Otherwise it's not really going to work and you'll start to make horrible marks on your model. And this is different to just applying paint from your sort of palette normally, because purely and simply when you're putting the brush to model in that sense, you see the colour change pretty much instantly. As you can see, there's also another bit of fabric under those robes which also needs painting. I'm going to apply effectively like a zenithal highlight, going from black to grey to white, with the most raised areas being white and obviously the grey being underneath and black being in the recesses. Once you've established that sort of zenithal highlight on those areas, you want to then use Sigvold Burgundy contrast paint to really make that area pop, as it's a very vibrant and heavily pigmented colour. With those fabrics done, you can actually see the bulk of the model is actually painted now. The next section we're going to look at is his armour. Now, I'm going to go with black because obviously he's a chaplain and that's traditionally what they are in the 40k setting. There are numerous ways to do this, but I'm going to go with the sort of black and blue sort of method. So to start with, you obviously want to base coat the armour black, and then you want to use a strong dark blue and effectively do a thick edge highlight over all those edges of the armour. And once you've done that thicker edge highlight, it's now time to do the finer edge highlight with a much lighter blue. Now, I've used strong dark blue mixed with turquoise 2:1. Once you've added all those highlights, you can see how it's really starting to make that armour pop a bit more. So just to add that extra little bit of detail to the armour, you want to add a little spot highlight to the sharpest edges where they'd most likely sort of be reflecting light. And to do that, we're going to use the previous mix, which was the strong dark blue with the turquoise, but we're going to mix that now with white at a ratio of 2:1. So like the green capelet earlier, I'm going to try and tie all those blacks and blues together a little bit more. I'm going to do that by using a heavily diluted mix of black Templar contrast paint. So with the armour done, it's now time to look at the other details dotted around the model. And I'm going to start by looking at the gold details. So I'm going to begin by basing all those areas in dark brown, because again, brown is a really good base for gold sort of metallics. Now once that's done, I'm going to mix brown with AK Interactive bronze. I then start to highlight those metallics by using pure bronze. Then the final highlight is a vibrant gold mixed with a light silver. This is then tied together using a diluted mix of Targor Raid Shade. Now with the gold done, it's time to look at the silver details. For silver, it's always good to either base it in either like a strong dark blue or black. And in this case, I'm just going to go with black. You then go in with a dark steel colour, and for this I'm going with Iron Warriors by Citadel. Then a final highlight is then applied to those silver areas, and I use a very bright silver for this, and I'm using AK Interactive's Natural Steel. And don't forget, if you go a little bit overboard with the highlights, you can always correct those mistakes by going back to the previous paint, which in this case was Iron Warriors. So once you're happy with those highlights, it's time to give those silver areas an all-over wash with the fan favourite and meme-friendly Nuln Oil. This is just to knock the brightness back a little bit. So it's time to look at that smoke detail coming out of his backpack. Now if you're assembling this model and you don't like the look of it, which I know a lot of people didn't, and it was a bit divisive, you can clearly skip this step. But I like the smoke because I think it's cool, so deal with it. Now I know you're probably tempted just to work with black, grey and sort of white for the smoke. I personally think it reads better if there's a little bit of colour in there, and I'm going to show you how to achieve this. So firstly, we're going to base coat all of that smoke black, and then we're going to apply a dark grey all over, but avoiding those recesses because we want to keep those dark. Now we want to start building up those highlights on the smoke, and we're going to do this by using AK Interactive German Grey mixed with AK Interactive Reddish Grey, and we're going to apply that all over the smoke. Okay, so for the next highlights, we're going to focus on the top 2/3 of that smoke, with that bottom third sort of round by his feet. We want to keep that much darker. We do this by applying reddish grey to that top 2/3. And then the final highlight is reddish grey mixed with rock grey. Okay, so now as you can see, that top sort of 2/3 and that bottom third, there should be a little bit of disparity between the two in terms of brightness, but it's time to blend them together. And we're going to do this by using a heavily diluted mix of black Templar contrast paint with contrast medium and apply that to the lower third of the smoke. And you want to apply this from the bottom and work your way upwards and blending it into the base of the areas of the top 2/3 we did previously. Okay, so now looking at the weapon handles, I decided to tie that sort of purple colour that we applied to that bit under his robe from earlier. And the reason for that is that I feel it sort of ties everything in, and I just think it looks more harmonious overall. But obviously you can paint the handles whatever colour you like, but I just thought it's nice just to tie it in. So if you want to paint them the same way I did, you basically repeat the steps that we did on the underrobe bit that he has, but then you build on it a little bit more with the highlights. I do this by using Screamer Pink and then Scream Pink mixed with Rock Grey for the final highlight. So we're nearly finished with the body of Asmodai. which is great and actually hasn't taken that long. So there's one final piece of the puzzle left to do, and that is the sword. Now I decided to go for a molten sword for this because why not? It's bloody cool. Now I'm just going to say before I continue that I'm going to be using an airbrush for these steps, just because it expedites the process. But you can actually replicate this using acrylic paints and a brush. You just have to work with the same sort of colour values. Now the sword base coated black, I then spray white ink through the airbrush, focusing the intensity on the top where the sort of hilt is of the sword and at the base where it's going into that helmet. And I do this because the white's going to add intensity to the next step. I then spray Imperial Fist contrast paint through the airbrush over those white areas. And as you can see, the yellow really punches through. And finally, I'm going to use an orange ink, and this one specifically from AK Interactive. I'm going to be spraying this along the edges of the blade, being careful now not to get close to where the yellow is because I want to get that sense of warmth emanating from the middle of the blade. Okay, so that's the airbrushing bit done, but to add the final touches to the blade, you want to get a little bit of sponge and go back to a dark brown, and again I'm using AK Interactive Grim Brown for this. You load the sponge up with the brown paint, but you want to remove a lot of the excess by dabbing it on a piece of kitchen paper or whatever you've got available, and then you gently tap it all along the edges of that blade, so it gives it that kind of crackling molten sort of effect where it's kind of cooling down a bit. Now bear in mind we've done this sort of molten sword, there's bound to be a light reflection coming off of it because it's going to be emanating a lot of heat. So I'm going to go back to the airbrush again now, and I'm going to spray that orange ink we used previously just onto that section directly opposite where the blade's going to be sitting. Now you want to be very careful with this step because you can go a little bit too overboard and it can look very saturated and just ruin the effect. If you want to replicate this but haven't got an airbrush, you can try and do this with brushes, but what you're going to have to do is that glazing technique we talked about earlier with the cream robe, you're going to want to do that with an orange. But again, just be very careful because it's easy to go way overboard. And that's Asmodai done. All you have to do now is just assemble him, do your basing and paint the base that comes with him if you want, or you can just put him on whatever base you want to put him on yourself. And yeah, that's him all ready to go. Now I have to say I had an absolute blast painting this guy. I know he's a bit divisive when he was first released, because I know a lot of people weren't too keen on the design, but I think he's awesome. And I think it sort of encapsulates the character really well. And in terms of building him, he's also quite straightforward as well. I was a bit concerned having the sub-assembly with the smoke, so I was like, oh, is this going to be a bit of an issue putting it all together? But in actuality, it wasn't. I highly recommend, if you are going to have the smoke coming out of the backpack, definitely do as a sub-assembly. Because as you can probably see, once that smoke's on there, getting access to those robes and things becomes a nightmare. You're not going to get that finish that you want to it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video and that you found my approach useful. As always, I'll provide links in the description for all the paints and tools I use throughout this process. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and if you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, as it does really help my channel. So as always, let your imagination soar and may your brushes be steady, and I'll see you in the next one.